Imagine this scene: a conference room full of people, heated discussions, everyone sharing their opinions, arguing, trying to convince others. But in the corner sits a person who barely says a word. They observe, analyze, wait. And when they finally speak, perhaps just a single sentence, the entire room falls silent and listens. Why? What gives the silent observer this uncanny power over everyone else? This question leads us to one of the most fascinating paradoxes of human interaction. The one who speaks the least often controls the most. Yet what Friedrich Nietzsche recognized over a century ago, modern psychology is only now beginning to fully understand. Silence is not weakness, but the ultimate form of power. Most people believe that power comes from dominance. Whoever speaks the loudest, presents the most arguments, fills the room with their personality, wins. But the truth is exactly the opposite. In his work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote, "Not by wrath does one kill, but by laughter." What did he mean? True power lies not in emotional reaction or incessant talking, but in conscious control. The ability to decide when to react and when to simply observe. The silent observer embodies exactly this control. Let's first consider what silence actually does in social situations. When someone remains silent in a group, it creates a form of psychological tension. This tension is so strong that it measurably alters the brain chemistry of others present. Neuroscientific studies have shown that silence in social contexts leads to increased activity in the amygdala regions, the same areas of the brain activated during threats. In other words, when you don't speak, you trigger subtle fear responses in others. Why is this? Because humans fundamentally fear uncertainty. When someone is silent, we don't know what they're thinking, whether they're judging us, whether they agree or disagree. This uncertainty makes us nervous, and we automatically begin to fill the gap. We talk more, reveal more, try to break the silence. In this moment, the silent observer has already won. They gather information while others give it away. American psychologist Robert Greene, who has studied power dynamics extensively, explains, "The more you say, the more common you appear. Each time we speak, we reveal something about ourselves. We show our cards." The silent observer, however, keeps their hand concealed. This information asymmetry is the first pillar of their power. But silence isn't just a way to gather information. It's also a powerful signal. Anthropologist Gregory Bateson noted that in every social hierarchy, those at the top need to communicate the least. Think of a lion resting majestically in the savannah, while other animals constantly make warning and submission sounds. The king doesn't need to constantly announce his position. His calmness is proof of his strength. We see similar patterns in humans. In a Harvard Business School study, executives who were considered particularly charismatic and assertive were observed. The surprising result: they spoke on average 30% less than their less successful colleagues. They listened more, observed the dynamics in the room, and chose their words carefully. Their silence gave their statements, when they finally spoke, disproportionate significance. Nietzsche recognized this phenomenon when he spoke of the psychology of power. For him, the Übermensch, his ideal of the self-determined human, was someone not driven by emotional reactions, but who consciously decides when to react and when to remain silent. The truly powerful person is not the one who constantly fights, but the one who controls the fight. We see this dynamic in countless contexts. Think of legendary investor Warren Buffett, known for his reserved manner and simple lifestyle in Nebraska, far from Wall Street. While other financial gurus are constantly present in the media announcing their opinions, Buffett rarely gives interviews. Yet when he speaks, markets move. His restraint amplifies the impact of his words. Or consider the case of Steve Jobs. In meetings, Jobs was often surprisingly quiet, letting others speak, observing. Designers and engineers at Apple reported how nerve-wracking this silence could be. But Jobs used these moments to understand the dynamics, identify weaknesses in arguments, and choose the right moment for his intervention. When he finally spoke, it was often with such clarity and focus that it redirected the entire discussion. Of course, silence isn't always a sign of power. Social psychologist Adam Galinsky distinguishes between strategic silence and silence born of fear or insecurity. The difference lies in body language, posture, and context. The powerful silent observer radiates a calm presence. They don't appear anxious or withdrawn, but attentive and conscious. We see this type of strategic silence in negotiations as well. A classic study from the Wharton School of Business showed that experienced negotiators remain silent for up to 60% of the conversation time. They ask questions, listen, and deliberately allow uncomfortable pauses to develop. Amateurs, on the other hand, find silence so uncomfortable that they often make unnecessary concessions just to break the tension. Why are we so susceptible to filling silence? The answer lies deep in our evolutionary history. Humans are social beings. We are programmed to establish connections, to be accepted, to understand our status in the group. Our brain interprets silence as potential rejection or threat. Social exclusion activates the same brain regions as physical pain, and silence can be perceived as a form of exclusion. The silent observer triggers these deeply rooted fears and uses them to their advantage. But what works for the silent observer isn't just a simple power tactic. There are deeper psychological benefits that go beyond mere social manipulation. Active silence enables deeper thinking. While others react emotionally, the silent observer has time to think. Neuroscientists have found that our brains make their most creative connections when we're not actively speaking. We can recognize patterns that would otherwise escape us. We can process emotions instead of being overwhelmed by them. The Japanese concept of ma, the meaningful pause, the space between things, captures this idea perfectly. In Japanese art, music, and even martial arts, ma is considered an active element, not an empty absence. The pause between notes makes the music. The calm before the strike gives it strength. The same applies to strategic silence in social situations. It is not passive, but highly active. A conscious restraint, a building of tension, a gathering of strength. Nietzsche called this the will to power, not as brutal dominance, but as self-control and strategic influence. We see the power of silence in the rhetoric of great speakers. Martin Luther King Jr., known for his stirring speeches, used strategic pauses to emphasize his most important points. These moments of silence amplified the impact of his words. Winston Churchill, perhaps one of the greatest orators of the 20th century, once said, "Only speak if you have something to say that is more important than silence." Silence also creates mystique and depth. In a world where everyone constantly shares their opinions, restrained speech signals self-control and superiority. Psychologist Susan Cain, author of the bestseller Quiet, argues that we live in a society of extroversion that overemphasizes quick thinking and spontaneous speaking. Yet often it's the introverts, the silent observers, who think most deeply and analyze most sharply. This leads us to an important insight. The silent observer doesn't remain silent due to a lack of ideas, but from an abundance of thoughts. They filter, prioritize, choose the perfect moment. It's not an absence of communication, but a higher form of it. But why has this type of subtle power become so rare in our modern lives? We live in a culture of excess, not just materially, but also communicatively. Social media rewards constant expressions, quick reactions, continuous presence. We are conditioned to believe that whoever speaks the loudest, fastest, most frequently wins. This cultural distortion makes the power of the silent observer even greater. In a world where everyone is shouting, the one who whispers has an unusual advantage. Their restraint becomes a distinguishing feature, a signal of depth and control. This brings us to the practical question: how can you use this insight in your own life? How do you become a powerful silent observer? It doesn't begin with silence, but with awareness, the understanding that every word we speak can both give and take away power. The first step is simple: slow down your reactions. Nietzsche recommended react late. In a world of immediate reactions, even a brief delay, a moment of reflection, is a powerful act of self-control. Before you answer, breathe. Observe the dynamics. Feel the impulse to speak without immediately giving into it. The second step is conscious listening. The silent observer doesn't remain silent out of disinterest, but listens actively, with an intensity that others can feel. This kind of focused attention is rare and therefore valuable. It conveys respect while simultaneously creating authority. The third step is practicing strategic pauses. In conversations, we tend to fill silence immediately. Resist this urge. Let your words take effect. Let others think, react, position themselves. These pauses create space for deeper understanding and give you time to plan your next step. The fourth step is precision. When you speak, do so with care and purpose. Eliminate superfluous words, filler words, nervous repetitions. Speak more slowly, deliberately. The quality of your words becomes more important than their quantity. It's important to understand that this isn't about completely falling silent or socially withdrawing. The powerful silent observer knows exactly when they must speak, and that's exactly what makes their intervention so effective. They don't remain silent out of fear or insecurity, but out of strategic calculation. This is the difference Nietzsche recognized between weak and strong silence. Weak silence comes from fear of rejection, of criticism, of confrontation. Strong silence, on the other hand, is a conscious choice, the decision to conserve energy, gather information, and wait for the perfect moment. In his treatise, Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche wrote, "He who has much joy must also be able to suffer much, and yet he holds the remedy against suffering in his hand." This remedy, he implied, is self-control, the ability to decide when to react and when to observe. Let's consider a concrete example of the power of strategic silence. In a classic Harvard study, negotiation dynamics between experienced and inexperienced participants were analyzed. The experienced negotiators spoke on average 40% less. Instead, they asked questions, listened attentively, and waited patiently for answers. The inexperienced participants felt so uncomfortable with the silence that they often revealed additional information or made unnecessary concessions. In the end, the silent negotiators systematically achieved better results, not through aggressive tactics, but through patient observation. This dynamic plays out every day in countless situations, in meetings, in personal relationships, in political debates. The impulse to speak, especially when we're nervous, is almost overwhelming. We feel a social obligation to fill gaps, express opinions, be present. But exactly this impulse can cost us power. In Zen Buddhism, there's a concept called mushin, the mind without mind, a state of perfect presence without attachment to thoughts or reactions. A master of mushin doesn't react impulsively, but observes, waits for the right moment. This attitude was cultivated by samurai warriors, who knew that impulsive reactions could be deadly. They waited for the perfect moment, not out of fear, but out of strategic wisdom. Modern neuroscience confirms this approach. Researchers have shown that emotional reactions originate in the limbic system of our brain, while self-control and strategic thinking take place in the prefrontal cortex. When we react impulsively, we let the older, more primitive brain system take control. When we pause, we activate the evolutionarily younger, more sophisticated part of our brain. In other words, silence gives us access to our higher cognitive functions. It allows us to go beyond the immediate emotional reaction and think more strategically. This is exactly what Nietzsche meant when he spoke of the Übermensch, someone who is not driven by reactive impulses, but consciously controls their own actions. This concept is also found in modern psychology. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman describes in his groundbreaking work, Thinking Fast and Slow, two thinking systems. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and emotional. System 2 is slower, more conscious, and logical. The silent observer uses the power of System 2, thinking while observing how others are driven by System 1. The power of the silent observer is not without ethical dimensions. Like any form of influence, strategic silence can also be misused. There is a difference between conscious silence as an act of self-control and manipulative silence aimed at unsettling or controlling others. This is the crucial difference between Nietzsche's Übermensch and a mere manipulator. The Übermensch strives for self-overcoming and personal sovereignty, not for petty dominance over others. His strategic silence serves a higher purpose: wisdom, clarity, deeper truth. In our world today, characterized by endless distractions and constant communication, the ability for conscious silence is perhaps more important than ever. It allows us to step out of reactive mode and enter a state of conscious observation. It gives us the freedom to choose when and how we communicate. Imagine how your interactions might change if you spoke less out of duty or nervousness and more from conscious decision. How would others perceive you? How would your own thinking change? How would the dynamics in your most important relationships develop? A powerful application of strategic silence is the response to provocation or criticism. When someone becomes emotional or aggressive, they usually expect a similar reaction. By remaining silent instead, we break this expectation and immediately gain the upper hand. The silence in such moments is not only a sign of self-control, but also a powerful psychological tactic. The Roman philosopher Seneca, a Stoic and contemporary of Nero, wrote, "Nothing gives one person so much advantage over another as the ability to remain calm and silent when answering injuries with silence." He recognized that emotional reactions drain our energy and weaken our position, while controlled silence preserves and strengthens our power. But strategic silence isn't just a defensive tool, it can also be used offensively. One of the most powerful applications of strategic silence is the silence technique in negotiations. After making an offer, you simply remain silent and wait. Most people find this silence so uncomfortable that they improve their offer or make concessions just to break the silence. Silence also creates projection surfaces. When we remain silent, others tend to project their own thoughts, fears, and desires into this void. The silent observer becomes a kind of mirror. They reflect the thoughts and emotions of others back while concealing their own. This mirror function not only provides them with information, but also a subtle form of control. This explains why silent people are often perceived as profound or wise, even if they haven't said anything special. Their silence is interpreted as meaningful, while constant talking is often considered superficial. As the philosopher Wittgenstein noted, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." This quote is often interpreted as a call for restraint on complex topics, but it also contains a deeper truth. Sometimes silence communicates depth more effectively than words. Strategic silence is particularly valuable in leadership positions. A leader who constantly talks stops learning. A leader who strategically remains silent continuously gathers information, understands the dynamics of their team, and recognizes problems before they escalate. Their interventions, when they come, are more targeted and effective because they're based on deeper understanding. This kind of attentive silence also creates space for others. When a leader speaks less, others have more opportunity to express their ideas and demonstrate their abilities. Paradoxically, this restraint can strengthen the leader's influence, as it fosters loyalty and respect while simultaneously making valuable information and perspectives accessible. The silent observer gains not only through what they don't say, but also through the quality of what they say when they finally speak. Their words carry weight because they don't get lost in a stream of trivial utterances. They are thoughtful, precise, meaningful. In a famous study by Stanford psychologists, participants were asked to present their most convincing arguments on various topics. The results were revealing. Those who paused and thought before contributing were rated twice as persuasive as those who answered immediately. The quality of their arguments wasn't just subjectively better, they actually contained more logical steps, considered more perspectives, and showed fewer thinking errors. The message is clear. If you want to gain persuasiveness, speak less, think more. The pause before the answer isn't empty time, it's the space where wisdom emerges. Nietzsche understood this dynamic intuitively. For him, the true master of power wasn't the one who constantly demonstrates strength, but the one who uses it in a controlled manner. The strongest person, he wrote, is not the one who always wins, but the one who remains invincible when they lose. Similarly, the most powerful communicator is not the one who speaks the most, but the one who communicates most effectively, often through conscious silence. The art lies not in dominating the stage, but in knowing when to enter it and when to leave it. Psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived the horrors of the Holocaust, recognized the transformative power of this space when he wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." The silent observer cultivates exactly this space, not just as a tactical tool, but as a source of personal sovereignty. In practice, this means we need to control our communicative impulses more consciously. Before an important conversation, we might ask ourselves, what is my goal? What information do I want to reveal? And what do I want to withhold? When is the optimal moment to speak? What dynamics emerge when I remain silent? This conscious reflection transforms communication from an automatic process into a strategic act. It also means we need to become more attentive in real time, more conscious of when we speak, what we say, and how it's received. The silent observer isn't absent or distant. They are intensely present, highly attentive to the nuances of interaction. Their silence isn't empty, but full of awareness. This heightened presence gives the silent observer an almost supernatural quality in social situations. While others are distracted by their own thoughts, emotions, and the urge to speak, they remain fully in the moment, perceiving subtle signals that escape others, and maintaining a strategic overview of the overall situation. This meta-perspective gives them a decisive advantage. They're not just playing the game, they understand the rules on a deeper level than most participants. The next time you're in a room full of voices, remember Nietzsche's insight. True power lies not with those who shout the loudest, but with those who remain silent most strategically. Observe, analyze, wait for the right moment. Your silence is not a weakness, it's your greatest strength. If you integrate this philosophy into your life, you won't just become more influential, you'll also think more clearly, understand more deeply, and communicate more authentically. You won't have less influence because you speak less, you'll have more influence precisely because you speak less. That's the paradox of the silent observer, the hidden power that has been used by the greatest thinkers, leaders, and strategists for millennia. So, what will you do? Will you continue to fill every silence, give in to every impulse, want to dominate every conversation? Or will you discover the subtle power of conscious silence, the power that emerges when you don't react, but observe? The decision is yours. But remember, in a world filled with noise, nothing is more powerful than conscious silence.